Living Out the Principles of the Ten Commandments, written by Dr. Trevor Orazio. Living out the principles of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the principles of God's kingdom and the rule by which all His creatures govern their lives. The basic, fundamental principle of these commandments is love, supreme love for their Creator God, and unselfish love for our fellow humans. This principle of unselfish love must be firmly entrenched in the fiber of our being, in the core of our inner sanctum, in order for us to be fitted for God's kingdom. The Ten Commandments are the practical outworking of this principle and their adaptation to the sinful context of human life. These commandments express in more details the important principle of living according to God's rule because they flow from the foundational love principle. The purpose of this brief study is to provide an exposition on how these commandments can be practically applied to human life. It also endeavors to show how critical it is for us to imbibe these principles if we intend to live under the rule of the great sovereign of the universe. The principle of first priority and primary love. The first commandment says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." God's work of transforming the sinner from a rebel into a loyal citizen for His kingdom is an arduous but joyous task. He takes pleasure in this work. What is involved in this work? I propose that God seeks to inculcate within us as believers the principles of the Ten Commandments, which are the same as those of heaven, so that we can begin to learn how to live in an atmosphere devoid of selfishness and filled with selfless love. Mankind's problem. We as sinners in our natural state operate by the principle of selfishness and are driven primarily by our own self-interest. Our whole agenda is motivated by self-seeking and self-gratification. We see ourselves as the sovereign of our lives. We put ourselves in the place of God. We think we know what is best for our lives. Our entire lives are at variance with the fundamental law of heaven. We live for ourselves. Heaven's law is to live for others. God is not our first priority or the primary love of our lives. Our needs, interests, and desires are the first priorities and the primary love of our lives. A primary love for God is the foundational principle and the first priority of the Ten Commandments and sovereign rule of God throughout His creation. Therefore, He must be the first and the best one in our lives. He cannot be second place. He must occupy first place or no place at all. The Bible spells it out very clearly. You shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. Heaven's foundation lies on this bedrock principle. As creatures from the hand of our Creator, our supreme happiness and joy are found only in the rendering of service to our God. He says to us, "I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." God identifies Himself as the God who delivers His people from bondage. He declares His place in lives by saying, "You shall have no other gods before me." In other words, God says, "You shall have me as God alone. You shall not have any other gods before me, after me, or in addition to me. I must not be the chief God, or the best God, or the highest God of your life. I must be the only God, the only one worthy of your supreme worship, affection, and allegiance. I tolerate no rivals. It is I and none other. I must have total supremacy and exclusivity in your lives." Only when God occupies His rightful place in our lives is there value in our lives. Let me illustrate. Imagine that you have 3 zeros and you place them all in a straight line. 0, 0, 0. You then put a number after the zeros. Let's put the number 7 after the zeros. 0007. The value of these zeros remains unchanged. They are still zeros. But let's say we put the number at the beginning of the zeros. 7000, 7,000. Suddenly, the zeros attain a significant value because of the placing of the numeral 7. It is the same with God. Only when He is in the first place can our lives become truly significant and valuable. All of our human activities and assets are worth nothing if God doesn't have His proper place in our lives. They are like zeros, worthless to our Creator and to us. The placement of this first principle in the Decalogue is not coincidental, but divinely intentional. This first principle addresses the fundamental problem of sin. Sin is really self-idolatry. We as humans have made ourselves our own God. We have taken the position and place of God in our lives. Sin is a form of self-worship. In order for humans to begin their journey back from the dark region of sin to the glorious land of righteousness, we must first understand and inculcate the foundational principle that God, the Creator of all, must take His rightful place in our lives. He must be the supreme and only object of worship, adoration, and praise. The imbibing of this fundamental principle has far-reaching implications for the believer. I want to elaborate on a few of them. First, we as committed Christians no longer live our lives as though they were our lives to live any way we want. Our lives are to be lived for Him, for His glory, and in His presence. The fulfillment of this will become the chief aim and desire of our lives. No decisions are made without consulting Him. It is our joy to carry out His wishes. We will say like Jesus, "It is my meat to do the will of my Father." Secondly, we live to glorify and honor our God. Our lives are not our own. We live for the glory and honor of our God. In all of our actions, thoughts, and words, we are always asking, does this glorify God? Will this bring glory and honor to His name? Life is no longer a quest for self-aggrandizement or a desire to fulfill our selfish ambitions. Third, we live our lives continually in His presence. Neither the presence nor absence of other people will determine how we live, for we are living for God. We are constantly aware that everything we do falls under His divine scrutiny. The principle of submission to divine sovereignty. The second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy to thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." God cannot be manipulated or fashioned after a human's design. People have always wanted to manipulate and control their environment. No wonder they created gods after their own image. They made gods of wood, stone, gold, and silver. They also worship gods of nature. The gods of nature were more problematic, for they seem outside of human control. But humans sought through continual appeasement to win their favor. So people resorted to offering their fair maidens, young men, food, and the blood of their captives to win the favor of these gods. Such societies continually live in fear of their own gods. By offering gifts to appease them, humans still attempt to control and manipulate the actions of these gods. These actions demonstrate the assumption that these gods are neither generous nor kind. They are capricious and judgmental. Therefore, we have to do something to change the minds of these gods towards us. In other words, Our actions as humans can influence the way we are treated by the gods. These gods must be bribed in order to act charitably towards humans. This is the characteristic of pagan worship. The gods do not render goodwill towards humans on their own initiative, but the actions of humans must prompt or convince the gods to act generously towards them. This commandment strictly prohibits any kind of action in which we attempt to manipulate God. God strictly prohibits the creation of any object to portray him. This is a very significant injunction because God is very much aware of our inclination to create things after our own image. The clearest example of this is how Christianity, which began in the pit hole of the Roman Empire, Palestine, has been co-opted, corrupted, and westernized so much that it resembles nothing of its earliest manifestations. The West has recreated a Western Christianity after its image. That is, we have made God into a Western deity. God prohibited his physical representation because he is the God of all people. He is Savior to the whole world, the master and sovereign of the entire universe. To create a picture of God is to restrict him to a specific group, thus giving an unfair advantage and the illusory feeling of superiority to the ethnic group. God is not American, British, German, French, Chinese, or Jewish. He transcends all nationalities, ethnicities, cultures, and races. In spite of this strict injunction against any pictorial representation of the deity, there has appeared in the last 500 years a picture that is purported to be Jesus, who is considered God by all mainstream Christians. Why has Western Christianity put toward this picture and proclaimed it as Jesus? Is this not a clear violation of the sacred commandment that prohibits material representation of God? All over the Western world, in churches, schools, museums, and other institutions, a so-called picture of Jesus is accepted by most people as actually being Jesus. No one seems to question the practice. Children are taught from infancy that this is indeed a picture of Jesus. Does a picture of Jesus actually exist? Do we know how Jesus looked? Is it right to put forth a picture and call it Jesus? What is the historic basis for this picture? Since Jesus came from a poor Jewish peasant family of the 1st century, he probably resembled an ordinary Jewish peasant of that time. Does the current accepted picture of Jesus fit? I think not. The long hair of the Jesus picture would be totally out of place for the peasant Jewish male of the 1st century. Jewish males did not wear their hair long except those who took the role of a Nazirite, example Samson, where their vows prohibited them from cutting their hair. So a long-haired picture clearly does not match the physical appearance of the typical 1st century Jewish peasant male. The larger issue, however, is the theological implication. For Christians to put forth a picture and call it a picture of Jesus, their God, is theological heresy. It is a clear violation of the injunction against making an image of God as set forth in the 2nd commandment. The sociological implications are also far-reaching, for the restriction of the Christian God to an ethnic group or race excludes 90% of the world's population and gives the 10% a certain feeling of smug superiority. We as humans thus created a God after our image, a God that looks like us, a God that is convenient and politically correct, a God that is a conscientious candidate acceptable to most, a God with a good public relations image, a God that we can manipulate and control to suit our own purposes. He is a God well suited for television, for he fits the profile of a typical television hero. The commandment is clear and explicit. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. What this commandment asks of us is tied with the first commandment, where we are called to acknowledge God as the supreme one in our lives, the one and only God who is worthy of our affection. This second commandment calls us to total surrender and submission to the one who is described in the principle of submission to divine sovereignty and acceptance of who God is without any attempt on our own part to try to shape and mold him after an image of our own making. To try to create an image or picture of God and present it as representing God is really another form of self-worship. What we are creating is our own creation, the work of our own hand, indeed of ourselves, which goes back again to the major characteristic of sin, self-worship. By insisting on the second commandment, God is again seeking to uproot that proclivity in us to want to worship ourselves and the works of our hand. It was Eve's desire to be like God that prompted her to take and eat of the forbidden fruit. So deep within the human psyche lies that desire to be like God, to be powerful, venerated, and worshipped. We not only have a need to worship someone, but we also desire to worship ourselves. This second commandment prepares us for heaven by pointing us away from any form of self-aggrandizement, self-promotion, self-honor, or self-glory. Like the angels of heaven, we should always declare, "Glory and honor, praise and worship be to the only true God and Father of us all." Those preparing to spend eternity with their Heavenly Father walk in constant humility and meekness before God. They don't boast of their accomplishments or broadcast their good deeds before the world. They engage in no form of self-promotion nor further their own interests. They seek only to advance the kingdom of God. When they do great deeds, they never take glory for themselves. They always point to the God who gave them the vision, strength, and resources to carry out his will. They live for the glory of their Creator and Redeemer. They never accept any worship or reverential awe from others because they are well aware of the dangers of self-worship. Constantly vigilant, they are always on guard, jealous for the glory of God, not of their own. They live not for themselves, but to carry out the will and purpose of God. They find their joy and fulfillment not in their agenda, but in God's. Principle of respect and honor for the sacred. The third commandment says, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." I call this commandment the principle of respect and honor for the sacred. Once we have acknowledged his place in our lives and our duty to surrender to him, God calls us to respect and honor the sacred, in particular, his name. All true respect and honor for the sacred begins with respecting God's name. His name is not merely some letters written in a book. It tells us who he is, what he represents. God's name is his divine character. We are called to respect God's name. We are not to repeat his name glibly or casually to claim his name as our own. To claim the name of God by our profession or words and then to contradict it by our lives violates the third commandment. We will be held accountable for our actions. This command speaks of how seriously we ought to deal with God. He is not a God to be trifled with. We cannot wear him on our sleeves when it is convenient, and then hide him away when it is inconvenient and embarrassing. Nothing is more important in our lives than our relationship to God. Nothing should take priority over our relationship with him. Here we see this commandment tied to the first. The seriousness with which we treat God is reflected in our relationship with him. Are we serious enough to spend time with him every day, faithfully studying his word and carrying out his commands to minister to those in need? So many Christians in the world take unto themselves the name of God. They profess with their lips that they are children of God, but contradict him by their own conduct. Every day they besmirch his name as they dishonor and disrespect him. They bear his name in vain. Respect for the sacred should also extend itself beyond God to respect for God's creation, whether it is human, animal, or plant life, for all life is seen as a sacred gift from the hand of the Creator. Those who would know and love their Creator will be advocates for the environment, the unborn fetus, the endangered species, the poor, and the underprivileged. They will fight against those who endanger, threaten, or extinguish life for the sake of profit and other selfish reasons. The preservation of God's awesome creation is the concern of those who live out the third principle in their lives. The preservation of God's awesome creation is the concern of those who live out the third principle in their lives. They cannot be silent when selfish men and women pollute the rivers, seas, and lakes, contaminate our soils, exterminate indiscriminately our wildlife population, and selfishly exploit our natural resources without any thought of consequences to the environment. They feel a strong sense of stewardship for God's magnificent gift of nature. In their own personal lifestyle, they practice recycling, protection of natural resources, and wise water conservation. They always encourage others to use God's gift wisely, beginning with members of their own families. This third commandment prepares us for heaven by nurturing in us a respect and reverence for the supreme being of the universe and for his magnificent creation. All God's creatures worship and revere his sacred person. Angels fall prostrate in his presence, crying, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty." This reverence for God extends to creation not in the sense of worshiping his creation, but in a sacred respect for his works and as stewards of his precious resources. We see ourselves as God's special caretakers, as managers of all his resources. We see his handiwork in nature, even among the destructive forces that are often used by God to carry out his purpose. We see God in every human face, no matter how different we are from each other. Everyone is our brother and our sister. None is to be reviled or despised, regardless of how sinful they are. All are precious in God's sight and deserve our equal respect and love. Principle of divine rest and celebration in relationships. The fourth commandment says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." The fourth commandment calls us to remember and keep the seventh day as God's Sabbath and as a memorial of his creation. I call this the principle of divine rest and the nurturing of love. The first 3 commandments start with a negative injunction. The fourth commandment is a positive command to remember and keep. Implication of the positive as opposed to the negative. The first 3 principles focus primarily on our relationship to God, with secondary implications for our fellow beings. This fourth principle binds the first 3 commands, which call us to build a relationship with God, to those commandments that follow the fourth, which call humans to be in fellowship with each other. It's like an equilateral triangle with God at the top and men and women at the base. Humans can have no relationship with God without fellowship with each other. We can have no fellowship with each other without a relationship with God. God sits at the apex of the triangle, and humans are joined together at the base. The Sabbath is a call by God to create the context for fellowship and growth. In the first command, God calls for primary acknowledgement of his place in the life of the believer. In the second commandment, he calls for our surrender to divine sovereignty. In the third commandment, he calls for respect for the sacred. In this fourth command, he calls for a place in time to nurture this relationship so love can be grown between himself and humans and among humans. No one is excluded in this temple of time. Children, servants, animals, and even the strangers. Here is God's affirmation of the value he places on all of his creation. He desires relationship with all, regardless of status, race, age, social standing, occupation, or religious affiliation. In this context of spiritual renewal and rest, exclusivity has no place. This speaks to the essence of true and acceptable worship before God. Unless our places of worship are accepting of all God's creatures, all humanity, not just people that look like us, then our worship is in vain and harkens back to self-worship. The worship of a God that looks like us and is created after our own image. Exclusive worship is idolatry, pure and simple, because it is a form of worshiping objects that resemble us. The Sabbath commandment reflects more clearly the nature of God than any other because it denies us the ability to concretize and make an image of our own likeness. God did not choose a thing or a place by which to memorialize his creation and establish a relationship. He knows human tendency to make gods after their own image and to worship them. Therefore, God chose time. The universality of time prevents people from claiming any exclusive right to it, for time is available to all in equal portions. It cannot be westernized or Africanized. We as humans cannot paint time in a picture like ourselves and proclaim it God resembling ourselves. We cannot control time, for it is beyond our grasp to manipulate or coerce. Time is subject to no one. We cannot speed it up or slow it down. We cannot go ahead of it or retrace our steps into it. We cannot change it into large or small portions and use it when it is convenient. We are forced into one option. We must be subjected to the universal march of time. From the king to the slave, all are subjected to time. Time is the ultimate master, subject to no one but God. Yet time is accessible to all. It brings its gift to everyone, no matter what their state is in life. It comes to all, everywhere with no physical distance or disability to limit its access. So God, by creating this context in time, expresses himself universally. Through time, he proclaims his sovereignty and his accessibility. Human's first full day of existence was a Sabbath. Eve's first sunset was a Sabbath. Her first sunrise was on a Sabbath. Adam and Eve rested before they worked to show that Sabbath was not about resting from work, but was primarily celebrating God's creation and sharing fellowship with him and with each other. Sabbath is for nurturing love and relationship. If that is the case, then exercising the 5 languages of love becomes critical in Sabbath keeping. According to family life educators, the 5 languages of love are words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, gifts, and acts of service. The experience of these gifts is especially relevant on the Sabbath, if indeed the Sabbath is the supreme day for nurturing love for God and our fellow beings. Words of affirmation speak of the praise that is due to God on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is about praising and extolling the great God who has done such marvelous things for his creatures, should draw from our lips praise, especially on the day he set apart to memorialize his creation. Words of affirmation should rise from our lips towards God in appreciation for his creation. This praise also should be for his redemption for us and his continual sustenance of our lives. The Sabbath eloquently proclaims his finished and completed work for our salvation. After he completed his work of creation, he rested. After completing his work of redemption on the cross, he rested. The Sabbath gives us a foretaste of our future eternal rest when we shall cease from all of life's burdens, sorrows, toil, and pain. Our words of affirmation are to be directed not only towards God, but also towards one another. Every Sabbath gives us the opportunity as fellow humans to affirm each other in love. The Sabbath itself is an affirmation of our common humanity, showing we are all the family of one Father. We affirm while being affirmed. It should be the day when husbands and wives bless each other and their children in very special ways. The Sabbath provides quality time. It is the temple in time. God has chosen for us to nurture a love relationship with Him. Love is a living organism that needs time to grow and mature. Each Sabbath provides a special oasis in time when God takes delight in nurturing and tending His holy plant of love. We should take this time each week from our mundane and everyday activities, from the pressures, stresses of work, and concerns for our own sustenance, to spend it with God in order for the holy plant to thrive. The Sabbath also affords us time to spend with each other, to devote and strengthen our relationships. Physical touch speaks of God's desire to have an intimate and close relationship. God's choice that the Sabbath would be humans' first full day of existence speaks about the heart of a God who hungers and longs for sweet communion and fellowship. Although we cannot touch Him or feel Him, His presence with us is no less real. It is closer than physical touch, for He dwells within our hearts through His Spirit. It is this physical touch that we extend to others as we fellowship each Sabbath. There is no true Sabbath keeping without joyous fellowship between brothers and sisters. Church must be a warm, homey atmosphere where members are embraced and loved. Even the love language of physical touch on the Sabbath is a divine imperative. Without it, we would soon wither and die. Gifts. Another love language must flow freely on the Sabbath. The Sabbath itself is a gift of love to us from the hands of our Creator. The Sabbath gift itself is a reminder of all the other wonderful gifts that He has poured upon us. The Sabbath is also the day that God invites us to bring our gifts to Him, our gifts of time, resources, and ourselves. It should be a time of joyous sharing among brothers and sisters, the sharing of laughter, joy, sorrow, resources, food, and ourselves. Whoever is in need on the Sabbath, whether for love, fellowship, food, or money, should not leave empty-handed. The fifth language of love is acts of service. The Sabbath is a special day for carrying out acts of service. No other day is more appropriate to carry out acts of mercy and love for God towards each other. Jesus performed most of His miracles on the Sabbath. It is the ideal day to work miracles of love on God's behalf. Instead of sleeping away the Sabbath hours, we should cheer up the lonely face of a prisoner, bring joy to the sick and the shut-in, visit missing members, write letters of encouragement, pray for wayward members, sing to the depressed and despondent, seek out the widows and the orphans, invite singles home for dinner, call a forgotten family member, heal a broken relationship, get rid of a grudge, and bind up the wounds of the broken-hearted. While the Sabbath eloquently proclaims God's completed work on man's behalf, it also challenges us to act as God's ambassadors. We can only act after having contemplated and rested in God's finished work for us. Our acts for God are not to find His favor. They grow out of our deep and profound appreciation for what He has already done for us. God never asks us to do anything that He has not already done on our behalf. It is His actions, His work, that draws and motivates us. It is not coincidental that human history begins by resting in God's finished act. We rest in order to work. We rest before we work. In God's scheme, rest always precedes work. For rest is really God's freely given grace. Once we receive it, we cannot help but work. It always motivates believers to work. The fifth commandment says, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." The fifth commandment, like the fourth commandment, is one of the only two positive commands. This must be of divine design. The Sabbath commandment is God's home and time to nurture love. The fifth commandment was linked to the fourth from creation week. It was near or on the Sabbath that God created the institution of marriage and the home. These two institutions continue to be the pillars of religion and human society. Together, they form the linchpin of the Ten Commandments. The fifth commandment is what I call the principle of honor for lawful authority. God in His wisdom has placed our parents as guardians over us. We are commanded to respect and honor them because it is within the home that we learn the skills necessary to function as law-abiding, God-fearing citizens. Woe to that nation where such values are not transmitted at home. Such a nation will not long survive. Its foundation will crumble, and the nation will dissolve. The home is God's ordained space to learn respect, honor, and obedience. Whenever these lessons are not taught and not learned, we witness a baleful increase of crime, violence, and immorality, war, and the unspeakable horrors of unrestrained evil. The fifth principle provides the building blocks for the establishment of civilized society. It speaks of the necessity of teaching values and skills to children so that they can function as respectful and civilized individuals. Commandment 5 begins with the focus of our relationship to each other. Principle 5 determines how we are socialized and trained at home and shapes how we relate to each other in society. The Ten Commandments end with, "Thou shalt not covet." This is the key commandment, for all sin begins in the mind. If sin can be eliminated at its most basic level, then countless miseries can be avoided. From the 10th to the 5th commandment, we can see an upward progression of escalating action. The 10th commandment speaks to the mind, its attitudes and internal aspects. The 9th commandment addresses words which are beyond attitudes that seek to destroy someone's reputation or character. The 8th commandment progresses from words to actions, where it is the commandment against stealing someone's possession, an action sin usually considered greater than simply lying. In the 7th commandment, the prohibition is against adultery. Destroying another's home, partner, and love is an even more serious action sin than stealing. This sequence of action culminates with the prohibition against taking another person's life, probably the ultimate action of destruction against another individual. What we see in these last 5 commandments is a clear progression from the internal thought of covetousness, culminating in the devastating and deadly sin of murder. The message is clear. Sin can only be destroyed when it is attacked at its root, its source, in the mind and the heart of human beings. Simple external behavioral change is never adequate. It is no wonder the Bible says we need a new heart, a new nature. The transformation must begin from the inside in order for it to be effective. However, the kind of human beings we turn out to be depends, to a large measure, on the home in which we were reared. Thus, the principle of lawful authority to one's parents is a vital principle in determining the character of a nation's citizens. If children learn to honor and respect their parents, the whole world would be a much better place. Building bigger prisons, adding more police officers, increasing the fines and the sentences for crimes are ineffective deterrents because they deal with the problem when it's too late. The evil of the problem must be dealt at its basic level, the home. When parents neglect their parental responsibilities and children flagrantly disobey their parents, then we are initiating the process for the violence, chaos, and immorality that blossom later in society. Disobedience to lawful authority at home translates into disobedience to any authority in society. Principle of sacredness and celebration of life. The sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill." This principle is a call to respect the sacredness of life and to celebrate the joy of life. God's nature is to create and nurture life. God's adversary, the devil, seeks to destroy life. He revels in destruction and death. We as children of our Creator will imitate our Heavenly Father by doing all we can to nurture and protect life. We will defend the unborn fetus, and will defend and protect the weak, the sick, the orphans, the poor, the homeless, and the rejected. How can we claim to defend the unborn fetus when we are indifferent to the plight of the born, the poor children of single mothers, the orphans, and the children that need our help? A pro-life stance leads us to be vigorous defenders and ardent advocates for the quality of life. A pro-life stance leads us to be vigorous defenders and ardent advocates for a quality of life that is healthy and nurturing for those born under unfortunate circumstances. This principle also celebrates life. Life is to be lived with compassion, joy, and enthusiasm. In all of God's marvelous creation, we see joy and hope. The innocent smile of a baby's face, the mating dance of the birds, the rebirth of nature during spring after a long cold winter, the warm summer sunshine upon our skin, the delicious golden apples falling from the tree. Life testifies of beauty, joy, and power. But even in nature, we experience dark forces. The wind and fire destroys millions of trees. Devastating tornadoes, earthquakes, cyclones, and hurricanes cause millions of dollars in damage and produce untold misery for millions of people. How are we to interpret this? These events suggest that even nature itself has been affected by sin. But even amidst the destructive forces of nature, we can still discern the hand of a loving God, mitigating the forces of destruction and even directing them towards the fulfillment of His ultimate purpose. Principle of protecting purity and keeping promises, commitment and loyalty to family. The seventh commandment says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." This principle speaks of protecting the purity of the family circle, keeping promises, and commitment to the family. The family is God's design for the reproduction and perpetuation of the human race. The marriage of a man and woman draws an exclusive boundary around that family unit. Adultery is the violation of that exclusive relationship. It destroys love and relationships, wrecks homes and lives, and long after the act is carried out, leaves a devastating legacy on generations yet unborn. This principle focuses on loyalty and promise-keeping. The Bible testifies that God keeps His promises towards His creatures, and He is faithful and loyal to His subjects. If we plan to be citizens of His kingdom, we must also learn the lessons of fidelity and loyalty. When we look in the eyes of another person and say, "I do until death do us part," those words must mean something. We must keep our words. We are released from them only at the death of a spouse, or when one has deliberately decided to abandon the relationship, never to return. Faithfulness and loyalty are essential virtues of those who will constitute the citizenry of the new earth. They have kept their promises to God and to each other. Their word is their bond. Although they may be vexed by the laws of men, harassed by the adversary, and persecuted on all sides, they remain loyal to God. Faithfulness and loyalty is the bond that holds the family together. The covenant concept is a promise of commitment binding two parties together. Marriage is used often in the Bible as an illustration of God's relationship with his people. The relationship between God and his people is close and intimate and exclusive. Implicit within every covenant is the possibility of betrayal. Embedded in every act of a covenant promise is the reality of disillusion, disobedience, and disappointment because of the sinfulness of humans. Because of this possibility of failure, we cannot live without forgiveness. Our sinful nature demands it. We must be willing to give and receive it. While we insist on fidelity in marriage, we must be willing to offer grace to those who have sometimes experienced failure in marriage. The principle of generosity and giving. The 8th commandment says, "Thou shalt not steal." This principle tells us humans to live lives of generosity and giving rather than grasping and taking. Taking that which does not belong to us, or even misusing what is ours, can be considered stealing. When the law of selflessness is operational within us, we will have no desire to take that which does not belong to us. This operational principle at work in our lives is not self-aggrandizement or self-fulfillment. Our lives will be God and other-centered. Our desires and wants are not important. They no longer steer the direction of our lives. What is important now is what our Father's will is. How can we serve? How can we help to fulfill some human need? These are the questions that dominate our consciousness. Stealing originates in selfishness, in grasping and taking from us with little thought of others. Stealing is the antithesis of heaven, where giving is the rule. It is never what we take from others, but what we can give. This principle is best expressed in the negative injunction, "Do not steal." It means to give generously of all that we are and that we have. If the command was written in the positive, it could read, "Give generously of yourself, time, talents, and resources to God and your neighbor." Never neglect an opportunity to do well and render generosity to all. The people of the kingdom are not opportunists or takers. They are not looking to advantage themselves at the expense of others or for the furthering of their own interests. On the contrary, they are diligent opportunists of generosity, always seeking those in need, always looking for opportunities to do good, always alert and ready to render acts of love and mercy. No one epitomizes this principle more than Wilson Trickett, a former economics professor from Andrews University. For over 20 years, he gave food and clothing to the graduate students and their families at Andrews University. He was relentless in his desire to help alleviate the needs of students. Through rain, snow, and sunshine, he brought food and clothing to hungry, needy students. His legacy of generosity will live on forever. If we see only the negative injunction not to steal, we miss the point. The command is not just to refrain from doing something bad. It implies embracing of the positive commandment to do good. God doesn't call us to the minimum standard of refraining from evil doing, but to the high standard of positively and enthusiastically embracing the doing of good. Instead of seeing this simply as not doing something, we must ask ourselves the question, what does it call me to do? The call not to steal implies a call to give wholeheartedly, generously, and enthusiastically. The 9th commandment says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." This principle of personal integrity and truth-telling is a mark of God's people in every age. The lives of God's children read like an open book, transparent and sincere. The Bible describes them as not having deceit in their mouths. They act out of the sincerity of their convictions and the purity of their motives. We who are God's children should exemplify truthfulness and honesty in thought, word, and conduct. In our relationship with others, we will not lie about ourselves or about others. We will not bear false witness against anyone, friend or foe. We don't manipulate the truth for our own interest. We have no hidden agenda. We speak the truth, always in love. God's children are characterized by an exemplary transparency. The inner man and the outer man are one. There is no cognitive dissonance, no gap between what one says and what one does. Our stated values and practiced values are the same. Our religion is to be authentic, believable, and credible. Principle of contentment and living with an attitude of gratitude. The 10th commandment says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is thy neighbor's." The final principle in the golden chain is living contentedly with an attitude of gratitude. Ignoring this command lies at the root of most evils. The desire to possess what others have, the unwillingness to be content with what we have, drives humans to lie, cheat, steal, covet, and even kill. Unless this pernicious and highly toxic weed is uprooted from our hearts, we will never escape doing all the other evils. This principle deals with matters of the heart, the internal desire and the motives. This principle addresses the basic source of our sinfulness, our selfishness. God calls us to a life of contentment and gratitude. Like Paul, we can say we must learn to be content in whatever state that we find ourselves. Living with this attitude leaves no room for the noxious weed of covetousness to flourish. There is no greedy grasping or ambitious desires for that which is not ours. At the foundation of God's law is the principle of unselfishness. This basic principle is to be operational in us, so that there will be no desire on our part to covet another person's possessions. Our lives are lived not to satisfy our own selfish desires, but to serve the interest and well-being of others. In God's system, each lives not for himself, but for others. When one covets and receives that which is coveted, is the desire quenched? No! The fulfillment of each new desire fuels new desires. Covetousness, then, leads into the unquenchable hell of infinite and unfulfilled desires. God is very explicit in this command. Do not covet anything that is your neighbor's. We must cut sin off at its most basic level, the level of desire. We are to give evil no room to grow. Allowing the noxious weed of covetousness to mature inevitably produces a harvest of evil. How do we live out this principle of contentment in our lives? We should accept all that God has given us with a true and sincere spirit of gratitude. We must not fall prey to the grass is greener on the other side philosophy. We need to accept each new day as a gift and a privilege from our Creator's hand, and we will practice the art of giving, and giving.